Hi, my name is Gus and this is my project management presentation. I'll begin with a project overview. The primary objective of the project was to develop a stylized first-person shooter that would have gameplay inspired by the old boomer shooter genre of games. I took inspiration from old games like Doom and also a more recent game called Post Void. And I wanted to develop a game that had fast-paced movement and combat that was mainly focused on like running and shooting through a level, which is why I chose that genre. The main focus of the entire project was the visual design. The rest of the project will have a strong focus on the artistic design choices with elements like the level scenery and the UI and the HUD. The final product of the project managed to achieve these goals. It had a 2 to 5 minute playable level, fast-paced movement and combat, stylized particles and visual effects, custom environments and level layout, a diegetic HUD and tutorial system, and lighting and post-processing effects. The project scope was set out right at the beginning before development. My original scope had visual design and player immersion as its primary design focus. I made a Moscow chart to detail what elements of the project that I wanted to focus on and have as core priorities for the final product, whilst also showing some of the things that I did not want to centre very much time on. So I'd set out the core deliverables for the project, and they were to develop a fully playable level alongside a level design document, and to create stylized visuals and gameplay systems that should be suitably demonstrated within that final product. The design focus was also set out at the beginning of the project, showing that the initial plans were to have this fast-paced gameplay with immersive HUD and just a strong visual atmosphere, as well as any extra visual effects as the primary priority of that whole project. And with the inspiration down here, this is Post Void, which is a game that I spent quite a decent amount of time researching and just studying. And you can see a lot of that throughout my literature review. The first piece of planning created was actually this kind of crude sketch that I made very quickly. And this was like right at the beginning. This was right at the stage where I was just throwing around ideas for what kind of game I wanted to make. And it seems like not a very significant piece of planning for me to mention, but I'll get back to that piece later. This is my Gantt chart that I created. It highlights all of the main tasks of the project alongside how long I wanted to spend on each of them and what sort of priority they held in comparison to the entire project scope. Purple items such as the particle effects, lighting tutorialization, they were all very high in priority as they were the core goals of the project. And the Gantt chart, it went through many iterations where sometimes I would overrun the set timing for a task, or sometimes I would manage to finish the task early. So being able to update and follow a structured chart like this really helped to keep track of my progress and to manage my time. This is an overview of my development process. So it began with the planning stages in the pre-production, and then it moved on to the basic prototyping and implementation of core gameplay mechanics. And then it shifted to a more focus on the visual and technical developments of the project, such as the different particles and the HUD effects, before it finally came to building the environment and adding all of the final visual flares and polish to the game that made it actually look complete. As well as following that large development plan, there were several times where I would have to go back on work completed previously in order to update it. So whilst largely I followed that order of planning, where it went from core mechanics to the secondary mechanics and then the polish, within that large workflow, there were several back steps and loops where I'd have to iterate over work that needed to be updated. And this all caused some of the priorities of the project to slowly shift during the process of development, and it kind of evolved the plan that I set out during the pre-production stage to something that was just completely different. The actual game development began with prototyping out the core mechanics of the project. So I've chosen to focus on some of the challenges faced throughout the development of these mechanics and how I used research or just iterative testing methods to improve and solve any of the challenges that I faced. This one here is about how I had to rework the enemy system from its initial implementation, because the enemy, they initially used layered widgets, and they were made visible or invisible depending on which sprite I wanted to be rendered. And this technique worked at the time, however, due to the nature of widgets, it had no lighting integration, and it was just incompatible with any of the decals or the shadows. And also having multiple widgets rendered for every enemy on the screen did have an impact on the performance. So this was one of the areas where I had to go and do some research on alternative ways to achieve the effect that I wanted. And eventually I remade the entire system, and I made use of 3D planes instead. And they had a dynamic material that I could use to switch the sprite at any time within the enemy's blueprint. And this was a big improvement to performance, and it also allowed me to use the decals and lights on the enemies for things such as blood effects and muzzle flashes that I wanted to implement in the future of the production. Similarly, the companion system was approached with an iterative mentality. In the planning stage, the core features expected for the dummy were established, such as the physics-based ragdoll and the dynamic speech and the tutorialization systems, and these goals, they slowly shifted during the development of the game. So some key challenges faced during the development of the dummy were primarily around the technical implementation of that 2D speech bubble, where having it look realistic and readable within the 3D game environment. Similarly to the enemy, I tried to implement the speech bubble as a widget, but I tried to implement it as part of the HUD, and it would update its screen space position to constantly be above the dummy within the game scene. And I had to eventually completely remake that to make use of planes once again and use the world space positioning. This was also my first time ever using enumerators and structures within Unreal. I had to look through a bunch of official documentation and videos to figure out how these worked, but I managed to implement them into the dummy's logic in a way that made everything just much more manageable and easier to update. So that is one area of research and development that I am particularly pleased with. The game's level design took a lot of inspiration from the examples that I mentioned previously. Games in the industry such as Doom and Post-Void share similar level design philosophies, and I tried to develop this into something that was suitable for my game. The visual design was also a core focus, meaning that the development of post-processing and lighting and particle effects were all very important. So here are some examples of how research and development had an impact on the project's development, with research into games I took as inspiration and leading to the level design choices. So research into UI and visual feedback for the player, that also helped me to guide where I wanted to take the visual design of the project, and also let me follow that initial idea of adding in a small companion system into the product. Once again, there were many challenges faced in the level design and finalization of the project, particularly in how well my hardware handled the engine, because Unreal Engine, it ran really poorly on the Mac that I was using. So working on lighting and working on graphics, that was a particular challenge, as I constantly had to have the lighting disabled or run the engine on its lowest graphic settings in order to keep the engine just running at a stable frame rate. And the destruction system, it was changed to a more optimized Niagara system after I struggled to get the Chaos system to work in a way that I wanted it to. Using Chaos also seemed a bit overkill for the simple destruction effect that I wanted, so that's another reason why I chose to make my own system for those. To reflect upon the progress made with this project, I think I'd like to discuss some of the technical and development skills that I've gained from making this game. These are mostly about the visual systems, like particles and dynamic materials and UI, and they're the things that I expected to learn about from the very start of the project. However, areas such as physics and ragdolls and the structures and enumerators that I talked about, they were all unexpected learning areas that I had no prior knowledge on, and I had to fully develop my knowledge just to implement those into this project. Once again, problem solving and iteration were key skills that I learned over the span of this project. Several of my systems had to be revisited, updated, or just completely remade from the ground up, there were many technical limitations that I just had to overcome and work through to get the project to come out successfully. Planning the project was a skill that definitely improved as I was following the project. I had to manage the scope of the game to keep it ambitious enough to demonstrate all of the visual effects that I wanted to explore in the final product, but whilst also not overbearing the design with an unsurmountable amount of work. And here are some areas that I feel could really be improved if I'd managed certain areas of the project better. Firstly, there were some partially rushed features like the facial expressions and the tutorial scripts. These are fully functional, however the way that they were implemented was not very professional and kind of messy. So if I had managed my time better, I may have been able to apply more time to these particular aspects of the project and improve them to be better than they are in their current state. Also, the enemies, they were not a core focus of the project, but if I were to expand this into a full game, it would be nice to expand upon them and add varying enemy AIs or varying different enemy types rather than just the ones that stand there and point and shoot. And sounds and music. This is an element that was cut completely due to time constraints, which is a shame. Having music and sounds would have definitely helped to elevate the atmosphere and gameplay. Some ways I could have made these improvements is through better testing and feedback. There were elements like the tutorial and the pacing of the gameplay that are very important to monitor, and especially when you're introducing brand new players to the game, is something that I should have explored more to be able to make the steps to fix the areas for the improvement in the game. And to finish off, here are some snapshots of my final deliverables. These are screenshots of the game's environment. Taking videos of the scenery was quite a big challenge because of my hardware and how it handled the engine, but I managed to take screenshots with the lighting rendered, and these are shown here. These are some of the textures I created to be used in the game, such as the elevator at the end of the game. There's the player's hand and arms right there, the health HUD display, some decals used to decorate the environment's rooms, and the different enemy sprites. There is a gameplay video available on my YouTube channel, and it's also posted on the forum. The quality and frame rate is really poor, so it isn't a perfect demonstration of the game, but it should give a general idea of what the game looks and plays like. And finally, just to end the presentation, I'd like to bring up the first ever sketch with a side-by-side with the screenshot from the final result of the project. I feel like it's a pretty good demonstration of how the project has shifted and evolved over time, but it has still kept many of its core gameplay mechanics that I had envisioned about 3 months ago. This sketch was not something I was anticipating to use in any of my official planning or documentation. Wasn't expecting to show it off, but I figured I'd just throw it in here. So, thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the game.